All right, well, thanks a lot for having me. Thank you for the invitation. Excited to do some philosophy with you today. So the talk is broadly in the area of free will and moral responsibility. And for any of you, and I think many of you have had exposure to philosophy, there's a lot of technical jargon. So let me just define some terms, and then I'll try to tell you a little bit more about what the paper's about, what my thesis is, and what we're going to be discussing today. So if you look on your handout, first couple of definitions. So compatibilism. So compatibilism is the view that free will and moral responsibility are, well, compatible with determinism. So that should be an easy name to remember. So libertarianism is a kind of contrary to compatibilism. So libertarians are incompatibilists. They say that free will and moral responsibility are incompatible with determinism. And they also go on to say that we actually are free and morally responsible agents. So libertarian says, look, if our world was deterministic, none of us would be free and morally responsible, but some of us, at least, are free and morally responsible, and thus our world is not deterministic. Rather, it's indeterministic. So an important commitment of the libertarian, it's important to realize, is a commitment to the existence of indeterminism. So libertarians and compatibilists tend to be sparring partners. Okay, so a couple other terms that somewhat cross purposes is this distinction between an agent-causal theory of free will and an event-causal theory of free will. So let me say a little bit about this. So by the term agent-causalist, I'm going to refer to a proponent of the following view. So here it is. It's a little technical, so let me read it and then I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So the agent-causal theory of free will says this. So an agent's action, let's just call it phi, is directly free only if S fundamentally causes phi. So the agent-causal theory of free will makes a couple of claims. So let me say something about what I mean by directly free actions. So a very common view about free will is that part of what it takes to be free is for you to have the ability to do otherwise. So for example, if you're coming to the lecture today was a free action, then it must have been possible for you to have not come to the lecture, for you to have done something else instead. So this is a very common view of free will. But people say, look, it seems like sometimes we're responsible for things or such, even if we couldn't have done otherwise. So take someone who ends up running over a pedestrian while driving intoxicated. You might think it's plausible to think, given their level of intoxication, they really didn't have control over what they were doing. So for example, maybe they really couldn't have done anything else at the time of hitting the pedestrian. And yet it still seems like they're responsible for this action. And so often what philosophers say is this, well, their action of hitting the pedestrian was what we can say is an indirectly free action. And the reason it was indirectly free is there was an earlier action they performed that they could have avoided, namely getting intoxicated. So although their action of hitting the pedestrian isn't directly free because they couldn't have done otherwise, it's indirectly free because it traces back to an earlier action they performed, namely choosing to get intoxicated. So that's about all I'm going to say about that distinction. What we want to focus on today is directly free action. That's really where the action is. So we want to wonder about what are the basic actions that we perform out of which our freedom comes or our responsibility comes. So that's what I mean by directly free action. Another important part of the agent-causal theory is this term fundamentally. Okay, so what does it mean to say you fundamentally cause one of your actions or you fundamentally bring something about? Well, to understand this, it will be helpful to talk about what's known as the event-causal theory of free will, because these theories, like compatibilism and libertarian, tend to be sparring partners. So here's the event-causal theory of free will. So it says this. It says an agent S's action is directly free if and only if certain S involving mental states and events non-deviantly cause, perhaps in a special way, phi. So let's take an example of this. So suppose you take the following action, going to the refrigerator to retrieve a beer. The action, going to the refrigerator to retrieve a beer. So you bring this about. Well, according to the event-causal theory, you're bringing that action about. You're causing your going to the refrigerator to retrieve a beer is wholly reducible to certain states of you causing that. For example, your desire to have another beer and your belief that there's one in the refrigerator. So when you bring it about that you walk to the refrigerator to retrieve another beer, the event causalist says all that is states of you, like your desires and beliefs causing that. Your causing something is just reducible to states and events of you causing something, like your desires about what to do and your beliefs about how to achieve your desires. So the agent causalist says, no, that's false. Perhaps your states, like your desires and your beliefs, are causally relevant. Perhaps part of what caused you to go to the refrigerator to retrieve a beer are your desires and beliefs. But that's not it. In addition to your mental states and mental events causing that, you also cause it. Right? You also cause it. So the thought is, your bringing something about isn't just reducible to your motivational state, your desires, your beliefs, your cares, your judgments, so on and so forth. Rather, you play an irreducible part in bringing about your free actions. Okay, so that's what the agent-causal theory says. You play an irreducible part in bringing about your free actions. Okay, so I'm going to use the agent-causal power, I'm going to use that phrase, to refer to this kind of power. So the agent-causal power, if you got it, that means you can be fundamentally causally relevant in bringing about your actions. Your actions are only caused by your desires and beliefs, but they're also caused, well, by you. All right, so here's the kind of lay of the literature. So you got compatibilists, you got libertarians, and then you have discussions about whether or not we should be event causalists or we should be agent causalists. Okay, so the agent causal theories. To say the agent causal theory is unpopular among contemporary philosophers would be a colossal understatement. I'm not sure there's any philosophical position in contemporary literature that's more derided than the agent causal position. Maybe substance dualism. That's a particularly hated position. But people just do not like the agent causal theory of free will, and they have particularly some contempt for it. So it's thought to be just a really very silly position. So part of what I want to do is counteract some of this. Part of what I want to do today is help us to understand why in the world we should be, or might be, attracted to something like the agent causal position on free will. So an interesting thing about the literature is that the agent causal theory is thought by most to be only a theory you would accept if you're a libertarian. So the thought is, if you're a libertarian, then there are reasons for being an agent causalist, but if you're a compatibilist, you have no reason whatsoever. So really my thesis today is going to argue that's false. So the reasons to be an agent causalist are not partisan like that. It's not that only libertarians have reasons. Rather, my thought is that if anybody has reasons, then everybody has reasons. That if libertarians have reason to go agent causal, then so do compatibilists. So part of what I want to try to do today is help us understand the true theoretical motivation for being an agent causalist, and to show that actually it's nonpartisan. So that's my main thesis. And I think a consequence of this conclusion will be that the agent causal theory will turn out to be a much more attractive theory than most contemporary philosophers have thought. Okay, but let me also add, I'm actually not going to be defending the agent causalist theory today. So if you're waiting for the decisive argument that's going to destroy all competition for the agent causal theory, you're going to be waiting a long time. Okay, so that's not going to happen today. Rather, I'm going to be defending this conditional. Anyone should be an agent causalist, then everybody should be an agent causalist. So here's the structure of the argument. So I'm going to begin with discussing what I call the standard argument for the agent causal theory of free will. And again, the standard argument for the agent causal theory of free will says, look, the reasons to be an agent causalist are distinctively libertarian ones, excuse me. That is, only if you're a libertarian should you accept the agent causal theory of free will. So I'm going to present that argument in the section 2, and then in section 3 I'm going to argue that the argument's no good. The argument fails. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And then in section 4, I'm going to turn to what I'm going to contend is the true theoretical motivation for the agent causal theory. And it's going to turn out that the true motivation for the agent causal theory has nothing to do with issues about indeterminism or issues about determinism, but rather has to do with issues about reductionism. Issues about reductionism. Okay, so that's the structure of the paper. All right, so section 2. So the standard argument for the agent causal theory of free will. Here's how it goes. So there's 3 argumentative steps. Step 1 is this. Compatibilism is false. So the first step in the standard argument for the agent causal theory is to argue that compatibilism is false. And there's various arguments for this, but the stock ones say something like this. Look, if our world was deterministic, then you can never do otherwise than you actually do. Everything you do is the inevitable consequence of the past and laws, and thus you couldn't have done otherwise. And thus you're not free. Others say, look, if determinism is true, then you're not the true sources of your actions. Your actions are just simply the causal result of events that happened way back around the beginning of this universe and the laws of nature. So you aren't the true source of your actions. Rather, it's just the past and events bringing things about. So we're not going to talk about, I'm not going to defend those kinds of arguments, but the way the standard argument begins is that compatibilism is false. So right from the get-go, the thought is, the reason to be an agent causalist is that's the best way to build a libertarian model of free will. So we recognize step one, that compatibilism is false. Free will and moral responsibility are incompatible with determinism. And now our question is, what's the best way to build a libertarian model? And we're going to see the argument contends the best way is an agent-causal way. Okay, so step one, compatibilism is false. Step two, well, this one's a little tricky, so let me read it to you and try to explain it. So step two says this. Right? So event-causal libertarianism cannot secure enhanced control vis-a-vis or with respect to event-causal compatibilism, since the only necessary difference between these theories is that the former requires the presence of indeterminism, and indeterminism cannot be control-enhancing. So there's two claims in that second point. So you have two theories, the event-causal libertarian theory and the event-causal compatibilist theory. And here are the two claims. Claim one, the only difference between these theories is that the event-causal libertarian requires indeterminism, well, whereas the event-causal compatibilist does not. So that's the first claim. And the second claim is that indeterminism by itself cannot enhance control. Indeterminism, the fact that your action perhaps was indeterministic, doesn't in any way enhance your control. So two claims. One's a comparative claim. It says the only difference between the event-causal libertarian and the event-causal compatibilist is that the libertarian requires indeterminism, whereas the compatibilist does not. The second claim is that indeterminism can enhance control. Okay, so let me try to spend a little more time developing this point. There's quite a few steps in it. Another way to put this point is this. The event-causal libertarian can't solve the problem of enhanced control. So what's the problem of enhanced control? Well, remember the libertarian says this. The libertarian says agents in deterministic worlds cannot be free or morally responsible. Why? Because agents in deterministic worlds can't possess the necessary degree or kind of control required for free will and moral responsibility. If you're in a deterministic world, you just can't have the necessary kind or degree of control for freedom and responsibility. Well, that means it's incumbent upon the libertarian to explain why in indeterministic worlds, rather than deterministic worlds, agents can possess more control. What is it about an indeterministic world that allows agents to possess either the kind or degree of control necessary for freedom and moral responsibility? Well, our second argument in a step says the event-causal libertarian just can't solve this problem. They just can't solve this problem. The event-causal libertarian has to be able to explain how indeterminism by itself enhances your control. And the contention is you can't do that. Well-known philosopher Gary Watson says trying to argue that indeterminism enhances control is like alchemy. It's like trying to get gold from straw. It just doesn't work. Here's a quote from a very well-known, probably the most important contemporary commentator on libertarianism, Randolph Clark. So here's what he says, articulating this problem. He says, the active control that is exercised on the event-causal libertarian view is, notice, just the same as that exercise on an event-causal compatibilist account. Since the type of libertarian view in question fails to secure the agent's exercise of any further positive powers to causally influence which of the alternative courses of events that are open will become actual. So libertarians have to explain how they get more control than compatibilists. And according to the problem of enhanced control, event-causal libertarians just can't discharge that explanatory burden. They just can't do it. All right, so step three. Whereas the event-causal libertarianism cannot solve the problem of enhanced control, agent-causal libertarians can. The agent-causal account can account for more control than is possible on the compatibilist account. That's what the third argumentative step contends. So the agent-causal theory solves the problem of enhanced control because, here's another quote from Randolph Clark, such an account provides also the exercise by the agent of a causal power to influence which alternative will be made actual that is not secured by the compatibilist views. So, unlike the event-causal libertarian, the agent-causal libertarian doesn't merely add indeterminism. They add indeterminism plus the agent-causal power. And it's that further power that's the source of your further control. So the agent-causal libertarian can secure enhanced control with respect to the event-causal compatibilist. Why? Because they add indeterminism and the agent-causal power. So the standard argument for the agent-causal theory says this. You should be an agent-causal libertarian because it's the only possible way to construct a satisfactory libertarian theory of free will. So according to this argument, it's important to realize the only reason you only have reason to be an agent-causal libertarian, excuse me, let me try that again. You only have reason to accept the agent-causal theory of free will if you have reason to accept libertarianism. So it's important to realize that's a commitment of the standard argument. It's an argument for the agent-causal theory within an incompatibilist or libertarian framework. Okay, so that's the argument. So I want to contend or show, I guess I'm going to contend, and I also hope to show, this argument fails. Okay, so a crucial assumption of the argument, the crucial assumption of this argument I just trotted out is this. The agent-causal power, possessing or exercising the agent-causal power, is incompatible with determinism. Okay, so do you see that? Right, so the argument assumes that the agent-causal power is incompatible with determinism. To convince you that it assumes this, suppose the opposite. Suppose, in fact, agents in deterministic worlds can exercise and possess the agent-causal power. Why is this a problem? Well, here's why. Remember what the problem was for the event-causal libertarian. The problem for the event-causal libertarian was this. When you compare event-causal compatibilism to event-causal libertarianism, there's one difference. What is it? Libertarian requires indeterminism. The event-causal compatibilist doesn't. Clark, as well as others, many others, say that's the problem with the event-causal libertarian. And then they say, but now compare event-causal compatibilism with agent-causal libertarianism. What's the difference? Well, the libertarian doesn't merely require indeterminism, they also require the agent-causal power. Thus, the agent-causal libertarian solves the problem of enhanced control. Well, if the agent-causal power can be had in deterministic worlds, then this is the wrong comparison. The agent-causal libertarian can't just show they secure more control than the event-causal compatibilist. They also have to show they can secure more control than the agent-causal compatibilist. And here's the problem. What's the difference between agent-causal libertarianism and agent-causal compatibilism? One thing. Indeterminism. It looks like they face the exact same problem as the event-causal libertarian. It was contended that the event-causal libertarian couldn't solve the problem of enhanced control because the only thing they add to their count is indeterminism. Well, it seems the same is true for the agent-causal libertarian if the agent-causal power is compatible with determinism. Now the only difference between the agent-causal libertarian and the agent-causal compatibilist is, again, indeterminism. So it looks like they face the same problem if the agent-causal power is compatible with determinism. Okay, so it looks like the standard argument for the agent-causal theory of free will assumes that the agent-causal power cannot be possessed or exercised in deterministic worlds. So now I'm going to argue that assumption is false. I'm going to argue that, in fact, the agent-causal power can be possessed in both logically and causally deterministic worlds, and thus the standard argument fails. Okay, so let me read quickly to you the definitions of these two species of determinism. So these are on your handout. So, logical determinism. So logical determinism obtains in a possible world W if and only if, for every possible world W star that has exactly the same laws of nature as W, and is exactly like W at any one point in time, W star is exactly like W at every point of time. Contrast logical determinism with causal determinism. So causal determinism obtains in a possible world W if and only if for every event E, and this is kind of a fudge, except perhaps for those at the very beginning of time, there is some event E star that causes E. And for every possible world E star that shares all and only the same laws as W, if E star occurs, then E star causes E and W star. Okay, so I'm sure your eyes glazed over at those. So here's the crucial idea. If determinism is true, then everything that happens in our world is the inevitable result of the past and laws of nature. So if determinism is true in our world, then your coming to class today was guaranteed to happen millions of years ago in virtue of the laws of nature and the way the world was. Everything that happens in our world is the inevitable result of the past and laws of nature. there's an important difference between logical and causal determinism. Logical determinism understands determinism in terms of logical entailments between what's going on at times, whereas causal determinism understands the relationship in terms of causation. So there's that important difference, but both of them hold the same crucial idea that everything that happens in a deterministic world is the inevitable result of the past and laws of nature. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take each species in turn. I'm first going to argue that agent causal power could exist in a logically deterministic world, and then I'm going to argue that the agent causal power could exist in a causally deterministic world. Okay, so first step. So this is section 3.1. So I got a case for you. So I have this on your handout. I'm just going to read through. It's a little complicated, so I wanted you to have it on your handout so you can read through and think about it. Okay, so suppose Jones, just some agent Jones, a recent high school graduate who, let's suppose, satisfies the agent causal theory, so he has the agent causal power, is deliberating about whether to attend Yale or Harvard. Okay, so he's deliberating about where should I go to college. He says, so defenders of the agent causal theory contend that Jones is possessing various motives, for example, him having certain desires and certain beliefs and certain cares about where to go to school, are relevant. Are relevant to attending each school, structures the probabilities for his exercising his agent causal power and making either decision. Let us suppose that given Jones's motives, the probability associated with his exercising his agent causal power to choose to attend Yale is 0.7. And suppose that Jones exercises his agent causal power to make this decision. We can explain, or at least so claim proponents of the agent causal theory, why Jones made this decision by citing his motives that raised the probability of his exercising his agent causal power to attend Yale to 0.7. So here's the thought. Some agent Jones is deliberating about where to go to school, and in deliberating you have all kinds of conflicting motives. Certain desires, certain reasons, certain beliefs, certain cares that may suggest it's better for you to go to Harvard, and others that may suggest that it's better for you to go to Yale. And the agent causalists say, look, part of what's going on in these motives is they structure the probabilities associated with your various choices. Right? Given your strong desire to live near your family, which is in driving distance to Yale, and given your belief that Yale and Harvard are comparable in quality, the likelihood that you choose to go to Yale is, let's say, 0.7. Okay, so that seems like a plausible way to understand deliberation, a plausible way to understand how motivations affect and structure the probabilities associated with our choices. Well, why is this important? Well, here's my thought. So this is over on the next page, page 3 at the top. So if we can conceive of motives structuring the probabilities of an agent's exercising his agent causal power, we should have little trouble conceiving of the probabilities as being 1. So we considered Jones, and it seemed readily imaginable that Jones's motivation structured the probability of his choosing to go to Yale, and specifically that it raised the probability to 0.7. But if you can imagine that, then you certainly can imagine his motives not just raising the probability to 0.7, but in fact, it raising the probability to 1, guaranteeing it, determining it, we might say. Okay, so given our present aims, we need not worry whether or not these explanations are defective in some sense. So the point here is this. If we can conceive of probabilities being associated with how agents exercise their agent causal power, we should have little trouble conceiving of the associated probabilities being 1. Okay, so if someone who wishes to say that the agent causal power is incompatible with logical determinism has to argue that there can be probabilities associated with the agent causal power, but they have to all be less than 1. They just can't go as high as 1. And no agent causalist has ever argued for this, and I have no idea how you could argue for this. It just seems obvious that the probabilities associated with your choices could be 1, and thus it seems clear that the agent causal power is compatible with logical determinism. Okay, so that's my argument that the agent causal power can be possessed and exercised in logically deterministic worlds. But it's important to realize for a whole lot of agent causalists, they say that what really worries us about determinism is causal determinism, the fact that somehow your actions are all causally determined by the past and laws of nature, things over which you have no control. So it may be a hollow victory to show that the agent causal power is compatible with logical determinism. People may say, well, is it compatible with causal determinism? Okay, so I want to argue that again, the answer is yes, it absolutely is compatible. So some agent causalists, this is section 3.2, argue that it is, so this is going to take a second to get your mind wrapped around, it's the causally complex event of Jones's fundamentally causing his decision to attend Yale that cannot be causally determined, or even caused for that matter. So Timothy O'Connor contends this. So here we're not just thinking of your decision, but we're thinking of your causing your decision. And O'Connor and others say, look, maybe your decision could be causally determined, but your causing your decision, that cannot be causally determined. So the results of your causation could be causally determined, right? Could be overdetermined, caused by something else, but your causing that event, that thing couldn't be caused. That thing couldn't be caused. Okay, so here's my response. Here's my response. So we can call this the agent causal event. So the agent causal event is just the event of you causing something. For example, Jones is causing his decision to attend Yale. So here's the reply. So the probabilities associated with exercises of the agent causal power are structured by the agent's motives. So remember we saw this in the case of Jones. His desires, his cares, his beliefs, well, they generate probabilities associated with his various possible choices, choosing to attend Yale or choosing to attend Harvard. It seems very plausible to think his motives structure the probabilities associated with his choices because the motives causally influence him. So we can ask, why do Jones's motives raise the probability of his choosing to attend Yale? And one explanation, a plausible one it seems to me, is because they causally influence which decision Jones will make. And the thought here is, again, the deterministic case will simply be the limiting one. In such a case, Jones's motives will raise the probability of the agents causing a certain decision to 1 because the motives deterministically cause Jones to choose or decide to go to Yale. So again, it seems like this is readily imaginable. It seems like we have no problem imagining an agent possessing and exercising the agent causal power in not only logically deterministic, but even causally deterministic worlds. Okay, so here's my conclusion from these two arguments. So here's my conclusion about the standard argument, so section 3.3. Exercises of the agent causal power are compatible with logical and causal determinism, and therefore the standard argument for the agent causal theory fails. It doesn't give us a reason to go agent causalist. Let me point out, and maybe we can talk about this more in the Q&A time, but I'm just going to blow past it. A corollary of this is the following. If the problem of enhanced control is a problem for some libertarians, it's a problem for all libertarians. So I'm really just trying to be thoroughly bipartisan in this paper. So if some libertarians, like the event causalists, have a difficult time answering the problem of enhanced control, it follows that the agent causalists are going to have the same problem. If that's not obvious to you, maybe we could talk about that in the Q&A time. Okay, so far I've argued for the following. The typical reason people give for being an agent causalist is no good. It just doesn't work. And so I think a lot of people, if they've thought about hard and long about issues of free will, would find this as a nice conclusion. They would say, yes, this just shows what I've always thought. The agent causal theory has nothing going for it. Right? So remember, I told you most people in the contemporary philosophical literature think the agent causal theory have nothing going for it. So they may think, see, this just shows there's nothing attractive or virtuous or important about the agent causal theory of free will. So I myself think this is far too quick of a conclusion. And in section 4, I'm going to try to suggest why. So I want to suggest a very different reason why we might be attracted to the agent causal theory of free will. And it has to do with what I'm contending is putting the self in self-determination. So it's important to realize that when we reflect on possessing free will, that this requires the power of self-determination. So what do I mean by self-determination? Well, this is the power to intervene among one's various and often conflicting motivations. So often we find ourselves having all kinds of motivations to do all kinds of different things. So we intervene among those, assess them, right? Which ones are good reasons, which ones are bad reasons, and on the basis of that assessing, select which motive to act upon. Now it's very important to realize all decisions aren't like this, or I should say all actions aren't like this. So a lot of actions we perform are rather mindless, right? So you're tapping your fingers, scratching an itch. Even sometimes very complex actions can be mindless, right? So you get home and you think, how did I get here, right? I don't remember making a single turn, applying pressure on the brake or on the gas, and yet I just drove 45 minutes, right? So it's very easy for us to go in this kind of automatic mode. So not all our actions are self-determined, but it seems like some are. It seems like in important times in our life, we face conflicting decisions we assess the various options and select what to do. That's the power of self-determination. That's the power of self-determination. Well, I want to give you a reason to think that power of self-determination is not reducible to events and states. You're exercising your power of self-determination couldn't just be reducible to desires, beliefs, cares, causing you to do things. And my argument for this is on the handout, and I call it the it ain't me argument. So premise 1 says this. So an agent self-determines a decision only if, 1, S adjudicates between his various motivations for or against D, and 2, on the basis of this adjudicating process, S determines or causes D. So premise 1 is just meant to be a statement of our concept of self-determination. So if someone asks you, what do you mean by self-determination? Well, here's what I mean. I mean the power to adjudicate, to assess, to weigh rival motivations, and on the basis of that adjudication, to select which option to do. That's what I mean by the power of self. You might mean something different. I don't mean to suggest that's what you're going to find in the Webster Dictionary, but that's how I'm using the term. Okay, so premise 2. S, right, this agent, exercises his power of self-determination only if he, and not something else, plays the intermediary causal roles of 1 and 2. So the thought here is this. Look, if I am the one that's self-determining my actions, then I better be the one who's weighing and assessing them, and I better be the one who's making the decision. Well, premise 3 says, but wait, you are not identical to any motivation. You're not identical to your desires. You're not identical to your beliefs. You're not identical to your cares. Nor are you identical to some combination of your desires, beliefs, and cares. So that means this. So here's conclusion, right, so here's 4. If only states and events cause D, for example, your desires, your cares, your beliefs, then you, right, then S does not self-determine D. Remember, for you to self-determine your action, you have to play these 2 causal roles. You have to adjudicate your motivations, you have to select them. But if what does the selecting are your desires, your beliefs, your cares, you ain't those. And thus, if they do the self-determining work, then you don't do the self-determining work. It ain't you. That's the thought. So conclusion, if S self-determines D, then S, and not merely states and events, cause D. In other words, if the conclusion is telling you that if you self-determine what you do, then you are fundamentally causally relevant, right? So the agent-causal theory. So the real reason for going agent-causal has nothing to do with determinism or indeterminism, but rather with avoiding reductionism about agency in the self. So notice in this argument I make no appeal to libertarianism, I make no appeal to compatibilism. Rather, I make appeal to anti-reductionism about what you are as a self and your agency. So to try to make this a little clearer, let me point out 2 main lines of response. So here are the 2 main lines of response I see to this argument. So the first, let me actually take the second. So the second response denies premise 3. So I call this identity reductionism. So identity reductionism is a kind of neo-humanism about the self. It says all you are is a collection of, well, maybe desires or maybe beliefs, but some kind of mental states. That's all you are, is just a collection. You're not something over and above that collection. You're not something that possesses desires, beliefs, and cares. You are your desires, beliefs, and cares. So that's what one possible way of rejecting the it ain't me arguments, to deny premise 3 and accept what I'm calling identity reductionism, reducing your identity as a self to states and events. So the it ain't me argument, right, rejects identity reductionism. It rejects reductionism about the self. But there's another way to go as well. Here we deny premise 2 and embrace what I call identification reductionism. And this might take a second moment to appreciate. So let's think about a very different context. So let's imagine that, right, let's think of feudal times, and a king appoints someone to be, right, the King of England appoints someone to be his foreign ambassador to France. Appoints someone to be his foreign ambassador in France. Well, that means, among other things, that the foreign ambassador, as it were, has the right to speak for the king, right? So when the foreign ambassador is in the court in France, he can make proclamations as though it was the king himself making proclamations. determination. So the foreign ambassador has been given authority by the king to speak for him. We could say the king is identified with his foreign ambassador. He has given authority to the ambassador to speak for him. So identification reductionists say, even though you aren't identical to your desires, your cares, I mean, you aren't just those things. You're something above them. You're identified with some of them. Some of your deepest cares, maybe the things you care the most about, you're identified with those. What do we mean? Well, they have authority to speak for you. And so when your care causes something, that just is, that just comes to, or amounts to, or counts as your causing something. So you aren't identical to those things, but they have authority to speak for you. You're identified with them. Okay, so the two ways to resist this argument is identification reductionism, rejecting premise 2, or identity reductionism, rejecting premise 3. So if the it ain't argument, according to the it ain't me argument, there are two broad possibilities when seeking to analyze the power of self-determination. You can be reductionist, or you can be non-reductionist. If you go reductionist, then either you need to endorse humanism about the self, or theory of identification about agency. Okay, so I think once we recognize this, so here will be my last point, we can see that the agent-causal theory has both broader scope and greater appeal than it might otherwise have seemed to be. So there's lots of compatibilists who have anti-reductionist leanings. There are lots of compatibilists that are not attracted to humanism about the self, nor are they attracted to identification theories of agency. But according to the standard argument for the agent-causal theory, they can't be agent-causalists. Because you can only be an agent-causalist if you're already a libertarian. So according to the standard argument for the agent-causal theory, the motivation for accepting agent-causal theory is narrow. It's only for libertarians. But under my argument, the agent-causal theory can appeal to both compatibilists and libertarians who have anti-reductionist leanings. And thus, according to my argument for the agent-causal theory, the agent-causal theory has broader scope than it might otherwise have seemed to. I also think my argument shows that the agent-causal theory has greater appeal than it might otherwise have seemed. There's lots of worries about humanism about the self. There's lots of worries about identification theories of agency. And so if you're faced with the following trilemma, either humanism, right, or identification theory, or the agent-causal theory, then my guess is the agent-causal theory is going to look a little more attractive than you might have realized. Because again, there's problems for these other two views. Now let me be careful here. I don't mean to suggest that we know that humanism is false, nor do I mean to suggest that we know a theory of identification is false. I just mean to suggest that there are serious and powerful objections to both of these. So once we recognize the true motivation for the agent-causal theory, I think we recognize that the reason, if anyone should be an agent-causalist, then everyone should be an agent-causalist. The reason for going agent-causalist has nothing to do about determinism, has nothing to do about indeterminism, but has to do with reductionism. And I think once we recognize this, we'll recognize that the agent-causal theory has both broader scope and greater appeal. All right, thank you.